promise was a ghost, a whisper of a man's voice carried away on the same wind that scoured the plains bare. Leanne stood on the warped porch of the cabin, the gray silk of her cheongsam a smudge of storm cloud against the endless, sun-bleached expanse. The man who had called himself her husband, Thomas, had brought her here with words like honey and bedrock, speaking of a future that would bloom in this stark country. He had pointed to the horizon and called it theirs. Then, one morning, with the sun just a sliver of blood on the edge of the world, he was gone. His horse, his rifle, his saddlebags, all vanished. He had left her with a half-empty sack of flour, a lame cow, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. For a week she waited, maintaining the quiet dignity her upbringing had instilled in her. She kept the cabin swept, though dust was its natural state. She wore the dress he had admired, a fine garment meant for a life of gentle ease, not for this raw, unforgiving land. Hope was a flickering candle she cupped with both hands, but the wind of each passing day blew stronger, and soon the flame was extinguished, leaving only the bitter scent of smoke and the darkness of reality. She was alone, a foreigner in a country that did not want her, abandoned on a patch of dirt that cared nothing for her survival. The first true wave of despair hit her not as a storm, but as a slow, cold tide, seeping into her bones until she felt as brittle as a dead leaf. She walked the perimeter of the small, neglected vegetable patch, the earth cracked and thirsty, and saw her own future in its barrenness. This place was a grave, and he had simply buried her in it before she had stopped breathing. The turning point was not a decision, but an instinct. It arrived with the first bite of an autumn wind that carried the thread of snow. Cold was a language she understood. Hunger, a fear that transcended culture. The ghost of Thomas and his broken promises could not keep her warm. The memory of a gentle life across the ocean could not fill her belly. Survival was a harsh, practical matter. Her gray cheongsam, a symbol of her old life and his betrayal, was tucked away. In its place she wore a pair of his old patched trousers and a rough wool shirt she found in a forgotten trunk. The fabric was coarse against her skin, a constant reminder of her new reality. Her first true labor was the well. It was shallow, the water tasting of mud and decay. With a rusted bucket and a fraying rope, she began to clear it, her soft hands, accustomed to embroidery needles and teacups, blistering and bleeding within the hour. Pain became her companion, exhaustion her blanket. She worked until her muscles screamed and her vision blurred, driven by a primal need that overshadowed all else. She learned the sun, its path across the sky, her only clock. She learned the wind, its changing whispers telling of rain or drought. The lame cow, which she had named Shimu, or Mother, became her confidant. In the lonely evenings, she would speak to the animal in her native tongue, her voice a soft murmur against the vast, indifferent silence of the prairie. She mended the fences with clumsy, determined hands, her fingers fumbling with the wire until they were raw. She coaxed life back into the parched vegetable garden, carrying endless buckets of water from the now clean well, her shadow a slow dancing figure under the relentless sun. Every sunrise was a victory, every sunset a reprieve. The despair did not vanish, but it was buried, layer by layer, under the hard-packed earth of necessity and toil. Years passed like seasons, each one carving new lines of resilience onto Leanne's face and into her soul. A land that was meant to be her tomb had become her sanctuary, her partner in a silent, enduring dance of survival. The ranch was no longer a monument to abandonment, but a testament to her will. The small cabin was weatherproofed and solid, its windows clean, its porch repaired. The vegetable garden was a riot of green and color, producing more than enough to sustain her. A small flock of chickens scratched in the dirt, and Shimu now had a healthy calf by her side. 2 sturdy horses, descendants of the one left behind, grazed peacefully in a pasture enclosed by a fence that was straight and strong. Leanne moved with the quiet, efficient grace of someone who knows every inch of their world. Her hands were no longer soft, they were calloused and capable, able to soothe a nervous horse, mend a harness, or pull a stubborn root from the earth with equal skill. She had learned to read the land, to understand its rhythms and its secrets. She knew where the wild herbs grew, which clouds carried rain, and the precise moment a calf was about to be born. Her solitude was no longer a crushing weight, but a comfortable cloak. The silence was filled not with ghosts, but with the familiar sounds of her world, the lowing of cattle, the nicker of horses, the rustle of wind through the tall grass she had allowed to grow as a barrier against the dust. She was the heart of this place, and it lived and breathed through her efforts. One afternoon, while mending a leather strap on the porch, she looked up at her reflection in a pane of glass. The woman who looked back was a stranger, her skin darkened by the sun, her eyes holding a deep, steady calm that had been forged in hardship. She was no longer waiting. She was home. He rode in from the west, a silhouette against the brutal afternoon sun, a figure made of dust and memory. Thomas felt the years in his bones, a deep ache that had nothing to do with the miles and everything to do with regret. He had left this place a desperate man, chasing a fool's dream of quick money to pay off a debt that threatened to swallow him whole. He had failed. Every venture had turned to ash. Every gamble had left him poorer in coin and in spirit. Now he was returning with nothing but the clothes on his back and a shame so heavy it felt like a shroud. He topped the familiar rise and pulled his horse to a halt, his breath catching in his throat. He was prepared for ruin, for a collapsed roof and overgrown fields, a testament to his own failure. He was not prepared for this. Below him, the ranch was an oasis of order and life. The cabin stood proud, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. The fences were taut lines drawn against the wildness of the prairie. A field of green corn stood tall and healthy, and the lowing of cattle reached him on the breeze. It was the dream he'd had for the place, but a dream he had never known how to build. Confusion warred with a dawning, impossible hope. He urged his horse forward, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. As he drew closer, he saw her. She was by the corral, her back to him, calming one of the horses with a low, gentle murmur. She wore men's trousers and a simple shirt, her hair tied back in a practical braid. For a moment, he did not recognize her. Then she turned, her eyes, dark and unreadable, locking onto his. It was Leanne, the delicate bride he had abandoned to what he was sure was a slow, lonely death. But there was nothing delicate about the woman who stood before him now. Her stillness was not fragile. It was rooted, as solid as the earth beneath her feet. He slid from his horse, the dust puffing around his worn boots. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with 5 years of unspoken words, of betrayal and survival. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. What could he say? "I'm sorry" felt like an insult, a pebble tossed into the vast canyon of her experience. He saw the ranch not just as land and buildings, but as a physical manifestation of her strength, and it humbled him to his very core. Every repaired board, every healthy animal, every thriving plant was a testament to her resilience and a judgment on his own weakness. Leanne simply watched him, her expression betraying nothing. Her gaze was not filled with the hatred he expected, nor the tears he might have once hoped for. It was the calm, assessing look of a landowner inspecting a stranger who had wandered onto her property. The power dynamic he had established 5 years ago had not just shifted, it had been utterly inverted. He was the supplicant, the ghost at her door. She was the master of this domain. Finally he found his voice, a rough, rusty thing. Leanne. He said her name, and it felt foreign on his tongue. She gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of acknowledgment, not of welcome. The well is deep, he managed, gesturing vaguely toward it. The water is sweet. Her voice was lower than he remembered, with a new timbre of quiet authority. It held no accusation, only a statement of fact. That night he did not presume to enter the cabin. He took his bedroll to the barn, a place that smelled of hay and horses and honest work. It felt more his speed than the clean, orderly home she had made. For days an unspoken arrangement settled between them. He rose at dawn, watching as she moved through her morning chores with an economy of motion he could only admire. He tried to help, to fall into the old rhythms of the ranch, but he found he was often in the way. She had her own systems, her own methods, honed by years of solitary practice. He would offer to mend a fence, only to find she had already done it. He would go to feed the stock, only to see her finishing the task. He was a guest on his own land, a stranger in the life he had abandoned. The reversal was absolute, a quiet, persistent torment that chipped away at his pride, leaving only a raw sense of awe. The disruption came in the form of a man named Finch, who arrived one morning in a polished buggy that seemed an affront to the dusty landscape. He was dressed in a fine city suit, a ledger tucked under his arm, and an air of smug authority clung to him like cheap cologne. He bypassed Thomas completely, his eyes settling on Leanne with a dismissive glance, seeing only a lone woman, an easy target. "Good morning," Finch began, his voice slick and condescending. "I am here on behalf of the county tax authority. This property, registered to a Thomas Cole, is in significant arrears." He opened his ledger with a flourish. "Several years of unpaid taxes, plus interest and penalties. The land is forfeit. I have the papers right here." He held out a sheaf of documents as if they were a death warrant. Thomas felt a surge of cold fury and stepped forward. "This is my property." Finch finally acknowledged him, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Ah, Mr. Cole, returned from the dead, have we? It matters little. The debt is legal, the claim is binding. You have 30 days to vacate." Leanne had remained silent, her hands still. She stepped forward, her calm presence a stark contrast to Finch's oily confidence and Thomas's simmering anger. She did not look at the papers. She looked directly into Finch's eyes. "This land is not forfeit," she said, her voice even and clear. Finch chuckled, a short, unpleasant sound. "My dear woman, the law is the law. You wouldn't understand these complex matters." Her gaze did not waver. "I understand the work of my own hands. I understand the water in the well and the stones in the field. This land is mine." Finch's smile tightened. He saw her defiance as a foolish, temporary obstacle. He underestimated her completely, seeing a provincial woman instead of the formidable survivor she had become. He had made a grave miscalculation, for Leanne was no longer a person to be dismissed. She was the spirit of the land itself, and she would not be easily moved. That evening the oppressive silence between Leanne and Thomas finally broke, fractured by the shared threat Finch represented. They sat at the small wooden table in the cabin, a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. For the first time, Thomas was inside the home she had made, and he felt the full weight of her accomplishment. It was clean, sparse, but filled with a quiet peace. Leanne placed the papers Finch had left on the table between them. "He is a vulture," she said, not with anger, but with the simple certainty of a naturalist identifying a species. Thomas looked at the documents, the legal jargon a familiar language of ruin. It was a version of the same trap that had sent him running all those years ago. "It was a debt," he said, his voice low, the words tasting like ash. Not taxes, not then. A gambling debt to a man who owned half the county. I thought if I went away I could win enough to pay him off and come back. It was a fool's plan. I lost everything, and I was too ashamed to return with nothing. He didn't offer it as an excuse, but as a confession. He laid his failure bare on the table between them. Leanne listened, her dark eyes watching his face in the lamplight. There was no judgment in her expression, only a quiet, unnerving stillness. She had survived his foolishness. She had paid the price for his shame. When he finished, she simply pushed the papers closer to him. "Read," she commanded softly. For hours they worked together, a strange and unlikely alliance forged in the crucible of a common enemy. He deciphered the dense legal text, and she listened, her sharp mind absorbing every detail. He found himself explaining concepts of deeds and liens, and she would ask questions that were surprisingly astute, cutting to the heart of the matter. A new respect began to dawn in him, a respect for her intelligence as well as her resilience. As the night wore on, the space between them seemed to shrink. They were no longer just a ghost and a survivor, but two people fighting for the same home. The next morning, Thomas rode into town. It was a journey he had dreaded, a return to a place where he was known as a failure and a coward. But this time he rode not for himself, but for Leanne. He carried the weight of her quiet trust, and it felt heavier and more important than any burden he had ever shouldered. The town of Redemption had grown, but the faces were familiar. He went directly to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a man who had known Thomas since he was a boy, a man whose weary eyes had seen every kind of trouble the frontier could offer. He listened to Thomas's story, his expression impassive, stroking his gray beard. His young deputy, Miller, stood by, skeptical and unimpressed. "Finch is a legitimate land agent, Thomas," Brody said, his voice gravelly. "His paperwork is usually ironclad. A tax debt is a tax debt." "It doesn't feel right," Thomas insisted. He was too confident. "And there's the matter of the original survey. The boundaries described in his claim, they feel wrong. Larger than I remember." Brody sighed, but there was a flicker of interest in his eyes. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man who understood that the law could be twisted. "I'll look into the county records," he conceded, "but don't get your hopes up." Thomas rode back to the ranch with a sliver of possibility. As he crested the familiar rise, he saw her, a small, determined figure moving across the landscape, checking the fence line. The sight filled him with a fierce, protective warmth he hadn't felt in years. The ranch was no longer just a piece of land he had once owned. It was her world, a living thing she had nurtured from the dust. That evening, he found her sharpening a hoe blade on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone a soothing sound in the twilight. He sat beside her, and for a long time they said nothing, simply sharing the quiet end of the day. He reached out and gently took the tool from her. "Let me," he said softly. As he worked the blade, their fingers brushed, a brief, accidental contact that sent a jolt through him. He looked up and met her eyes, and in their dark depths he saw not just strength, but a flicker of a long-buried vulnerability, a hint of the woman she had once been. Finch returned 2 weeks later, not alone. He rode in his buggy, flanked by Sheriff Brody and Deputy Miller on horseback. He wore an expression of undisguised triumph, certain of his victory. They reined in their horses in the yard, the dust settling around them. Thomas stood on the porch, his hand resting near the worn grip of his holstered pistol, an old instinct he couldn't shake. But Leanne emerged from the cabin and walked past him, her steps measured and calm. She faced the men, her small stature no measure of the powerful presence she commanded. "Sheriff," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, "Mr. Finch's claim is based on a fraudulent survey." Finch scoffed. "Absurd. The documents are certified by the county surveyor's office." "The documents are based on a map," Leanne stated. "I am based on the land." She turned and began to walk toward the eastern pasture. "Please follow me." Puzzled but intrigued, Brody dismounted, gesturing for the others to do the same. Leanne led them not to a fence post or a landmark, but to a shallow, overgrown creek bed, nearly invisible unless one knew it was there. She pointed to a cluster of old, gnarled cottonwoods. "The original deed for this property, filed 30 years ago, marks the eastern boundary at the Buried Stones by the Dry Creek, not at the ridge as Mr. Finch's map claims." She knelt down and began to dig with her bare hands in the soft earth at the base of the largest tree. Thomas watched, his heart in his throat, as she uncovered the top of a large, flat stone, its surface bearing a crudely chiseled X. She had found it. A detail only someone who had walked and worked and lived on every inch of this land could ever discover. Sheriff Brody knelt, examining the stone and then looking at the papers Thomas had given him. He looked from the stone to the distant ridge, and a slow understanding dawned on his face. Finch's claim had deliberately inflated the property size, manufacturing a larger tax burden that he knew would be impossible to pay. It was a common, predatory swindle. The sheriff stood up, his gaze hard as granite as it settled on Finch. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I think you and I need to have a long talk back in town." The departure of the lawmen with a sputtering, defeated Finch in tow left a profound quiet in their wake. The dust settled, the sun beat down, and the world seemed to return to its proper rhythm. Leanne and Thomas stood in the yard, the space between them now cleared of threats and old ghosts. All that remained was the truth of the past 5 years. He turned to her, the words he needed to say feeling both monumental and inadequate. "Leanne," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. What I did was unforgivable. I left you to die, and you created life. This place, everything here, it isn't mine. It was never mine. It's yours. You built it from my failure." He looked at the thriving ranch around them, at the solid cabin, the healthy animals, the testament to her incredible spirit. "I will leave in the morning. I won't cast my shadow on you any longer." He expected her to nod, to accept his departure as the final, just closing of the circle. Instead, she was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, the place he had once pointed to and called theirs. When she finally looked at him, her eyes held a deep, complicated softness he had never seen before. She took a small step closer, her presence a warmth against the vastness of the plains. "A person alone is a stone," she said, her voice a low murmur. "Two people can build a house." It was not a plea, but an offering, a statement of a future if he was brave enough to accept it. He looked into her eyes and saw not the fragile bride he had wronged, but his equal, a partner forged in fire and earth. He saw home. A slow smile touched his lips for the first time in years, a genuine expression of hope. He reached out, not to take, but to offer, and his hand found hers. Her calloused fingers curled around his, a perfect, grounding fit. This story is a testament to the quiet strength that resides in the human heart, and the idea that a home is not something you own, but something you build with love and resilience. If you were moved by Leanne's journey and Thomas's redemption, please show your support. Hit that like button, leave a comment below sharing your favorite moment, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more inspirational stories of the heart. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these narratives to life. Thank you for watching.